Recovered Voices is an attempt to bring into the repertory much music that was lost due to the Nazi suppression. The term was coined at Los Angeles Opera when we started doing operas by some of these composers. And the term belongs to them, and we use it here at the Colburn School in Los Angeles with their permission. And the purpose of Recovered Voices is to promote performance of these many works by dozens of composers that have been ignored. And so we concentrate on that here at the Colburn School in encouraging performance and in encouraging the public to take an interest and to familiarize themselves with a lot of that music. I'm often asked if this was music that was written in concentration camps and if that is its focus. And the answer is no, and perhaps 2% at a liberal estimate of this music was actually written in a concentration camp. There are some notable exceptions to that, but they are few, and little is left behind from the concentration camps. This is not about that. This is restoring to the repertory, or bringing to the repertory for the first time, music that was written anywhere from 1945 back to the end of the 19th century, which was banned by the Nazis and which laid fallow for a very long time. Some of it has still not been brought back. And at a certain moment, there's a sort of an epiphany. The moment when you realize that all of these composers have remained neglected to one degree or another because of a non-artistic factor. There was nothing artistic in the judgment of the Nazis whose music was to be banned and whose not. It was completely political, racial, and genocidal. No artistic qualities or no artistic was taken into account. So we have to now hear it so that we can decide, is this good? Is this not good? Do I like it? Do I not like it? I don't think anybody should feel bad or guilty if they're not familiar with these composers. Take me as an example. I was 40 years old before I became aware of, really, the existence of all of this music. And I'm a person who, since the age of 11, has ate, slept, and drank music every day of my life. So it's not surprising that the average music lover, or even most musicians, will not have come across a lot of it. And that, of course, was the intent of the Nazi regime. They didn't want me to know about it. They didn't want you to know about it. They didn't want anybody to know about it. That was its purpose. And our purpose is to turn that around. First, make the names familiar, and then to make a lot of that music familiar. And then we can judge, you can judge what you like, what you don't like. But it needs a fair hearing. And if it's not heard, it's like the tree in the forest. If you don't hear music, it's as if it doesn't exist. My own personal journey into this entire subject, into this new world, started on a rainy night in Cologne, in Germany, during the years I lived there, listening to the radio in between finishing a late night dinner and getting to my home. I heard a piece that so enthralled me that I couldn't leave the car until I knew what it was. And it turned out to be Alexander Zemlinsky's Die Seejungfrau, the mermaid. It started there, and then it grew naturally and organically. It was not a decision to find out about this music. The music came to me. And then when I pursued it and other compositions by Zemlinsky, and then through reading about Zemlinsky, other names came forward. First, Franz Schreker, then Walter Braunfels. Then I learned about the Terezin composers. And then I learned about Erwin Schulhoff. And so it built out like that.
In classical music training, we're taught the classics. We're taught Mozart, Beethoven, Mahler, Strauss, and even in our education, a lot of it is the same kind of composers. And so when we come across composers like Schulhoff, people that are often forgotten in history, it brings a new kind of exciting thing to work on, because we're so used to listening to the classic Beethoven 5, Mahler 9, to be able to perform and to work on something else is just an incredible opportunity. I was fascinated when I first played the string quartet back in 2019. I had heard 4 of my other classmates, another string quartet, play it the year before, and when I first heard it, I was like, wow, that is so unique and exciting. I couldn't believe how sucked in I was into that performance. And I knew that I really wanted to play that piece. I think that this project in particular is fantastic because the more people that we share this music with, the better. And hopefully it inspires other quartets and other musicians to look into his music and program it more often.
His music is so creative, is so vivacious. There's so much life and personality and character in every single movement of every work that he's written. In this quartet that we're playing, you have anything from waltzes to a frantic scherzo to milongas and that kind of style of music, and he hacks it in to just a really short amount of time, but every note counts in a piece like that. And that's something that is really special. And that's something that I really look out for when deciding to play a piece of music. And his music is really vital in that way, especially when programming, you know.
The importance of history cannot be underestimated. And this music has been ignored in the recounting of the 20th century. Music history has been written for the 20th century with the omission of many of these names, and certainly the significance of their various musical styles. And until that's corrected, I don't think we have a proper vision. And I think in today's world, we are particularly keen, again, revisiting the past and understanding what we may have gotten wrong, what is been passed on as true, untrue, not quite true, omissions, inaccuracies. I think that we need, as a classical music community, to dig deeper into the 20th century and to bring out this group of composers and the music and to understand why we don't know them, which was, of course, political and racist suppression. And it is horrifying to realize that the damage that was done in the 12, 13 years of the Nazi regime has taken decades and decades to correct. But destruction is easy and quick, and reconstruction is slow and perhaps laborious, but it is very important that we restore to civilization what belongs to our civilization. The recovered voices, the composers, the music, is not a great monolith. They are all the same. They all have something in common. Their music may have very little in common. The only common thread is the fact that we don't know them, in my opinion, because they were blocked, banned, and eliminated in many cases by the Nazi regime. Now, if you take some examples, emigration, Alexander Zemlinsky, already as an old man, emigrated and spent his last years pretty much ignored on the west side of Manhattan. You take a case like Franz Schrager, one of the rare cases where the tension of the Nazi pressure caused him to have a stroke. He died very early, 1934. He settled in Berlin, where he held the highest academic position in Germany, which was the director of the conservatory, the Berlin Hochschule. The Nazis diminished him, moved him to a smaller conservatory, then fired him from that, then took away his pension, and he died an early death. His music had been played all over Germany. When his widow, who had escaped to Buenos Aires, returned to Germany after the war, she said that she went through all the bookshops and music shops, and she could not find a single copy of his music. Now that is a very concrete example how the burning of books and the burning of music could accomplish that terrible deed. Another case is that of Walter Braunfels, who did escape and hide close to the border of Switzerland. But he did lose his major position, which was director of the conservatory, the Hochschule, in Cologne. And he never really regained his momentum when he did come back to Cologne years later. So we should not make the mistake of thinking that all these lives are the same, that they all have a common viewpoint on music, that their music is similar. Their music is very dissimilar. The music of Zemlinsky and Schulhoff are absolutely opposed to one another. The music of Franz Schreker and that of Kurt Weill, the early Kurt Weill, the German years before he came to America, very contrasted. Erwin Schulhoff went off on a direction all by himself. Now, Erwin Schulhoff is a particularly interesting composer and man. He was an avant-gardist back in the time already just after the First World War. He went on to go through several metamorphoses of his style, including, and most importantly, jazz, because this was something that was very important to him. And in his later years, he became a convinced Marxist, as did many young intellectuals in Europe, and that informed his music in the later period. Now, this extraordinarily creative individual's life came to an end in a concentration camp in 1942 in Bavaria, cutting short one of the most productive minds that comes out of this period.
I think Schulhoff is a really fascinating figure because he represents very much a missing link in Western art music that was caused by the rise of National Socialism and the destruction of the cultural gardens and the cultural milieu in many areas of Europe that the Nazis became under the control of National Socialism. And for Schulhoff in particular, he represents a really interesting sort of amalgamation of different classical styles, where you hear him, definitely descendant of Janáček, the wonderful Czech composer, and you also hear elements, I believe, of some of the French Impressionists. I mean, he butted heads with Debussy, but in some of his music, you can definitely hear Debussy in there. You have works of American jazz that are incorporated into his music, and then he's really interesting because he blends so many different compositional styles, which is what makes him, I believe, a really fascinating sort of puzzle piece connecting different Western aesthetic schools of classical music. And that's why his music on a music historical level is really important nowadays, because it represents a really fascinating musical link between these different styles of Western art music that I think is not known enough. I mean, I certainly didn't learn about it in my musicology courses in my undergraduate, or, it's something that should be in every textbook and every concert hall to help understand how all of these different styles come together. And Schulhoff is one of those composers that really brings things together.
My work with Recovered Voices really involves two parts. One part is working with musicians, and I have taken advantage of that with symphony orchestras on both continents, both America and Europe, and opera houses as well. Another factor, of course, very important, is education. And that education also has two aspects. One is working with young people, because young people are going to bring this mission into the future. This is the generation now that is studying, that is actually going to make a big difference. And another aspect here at the Colburn School is public education. And so consequently, talks, conversations, symposia, just simply letting the word out to people to familiarize them and to whet their appetites, make them curious to hear some of this music. Part of our goal here is to encourage the present generation and the future generations to become acquainted with this music and to play it. These young musicians are going to pass this on into future concert halls, recording studios, opera houses. For that reason, I'm particularly gratified to see now students who take the initiative themselves. And a good example of that is a young violinist, Adam Milstein, who has gathered other of his friends and colleagues and musicians and has created projects to perform the music of Schulhoff that now he loves in the same way I love.
Because of the Ziering-Conlon initiative for recovered voices, I personally have found, legitimately, I think, it might be my life's purpose, honestly. I haven't felt so assured about something in my life because I so strongly believe in these composers. I so strongly believe in Schulhoff in particular. And for me personally, I've been doing so much more research into all these different composers that are under the Recovered Voices Initiative umbrella, if you will, and just diving deep into their music. There's literally a treasure trove of 20th century masterpieces.
First of all, I think restoration of works of art that have been lost through war is a very important thing to do. In the case of classical music, that can only be done by performance. There's a lot of great music and there's a lot of good music that we don't know, that we should know. It's a part of our inheritances. We should be able to listen and, if you need to, judge this music, but after we've heard it, not in the absence of knowledge. There are three overwhelming reasons that stay with me for why we need to visit this music. The first is a moral one. I believe it's our duty as citizens to undo any injustice that we can. We can't undo all injustices. We can't give these composers their lives back. But we can do the one thing that I believe would mean more to them than anything else, and that is let the world hear their music. The second reason, a historical reason, the history of the 20th century has been written with enormous omissions. And I believe it's the mandate of any historian, when new information becomes available, to revisit the subject, whatever it should be. Is it the Civil War? Is it ancient China? Is it the Persian Empire? Is it pre-Columbian South America? Whatever it is, more information. The historian's job is to put it in a perspective and to understand it. And we need to do this again with classical music in the 20th century. And the third reason, and the most important reason, is artistic. I believe there's a lot of good music, much more than any of you can possibly listen to in a year, in 2 years. There's a lot. And while we do concentrate and should concentrate in contemporary music and the creation of new music, and we should encourage composers and composition to continue on in this tradition, we should not lose sight of the fact that an old book that we read for the first time is a new book. A piece of music that was written in the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century, that we have never heard, in essence, is new for us. It opens our ears in a new way. And so while we forge ahead in the present and into the future, we should also not forget the past. And the past is a part of our present when we bring it into the present. What happened after 1945, and why is that not the end of the story of what happened to this music? The answer is because there was actually, in a certain way, no infrastructure to bring that music right back and start playing it. Why? Many of the musicians who knew these composers had been eliminated through the genocide. Many had fled, emigrated to the United States, to England, to the Soviet Union, as far afield as the Far East, to the Middle East. So the environment where this music was known, to the people it was known, they weren't there anymore to defend it. You couldn't defend it for the next generation if there was nobody there to teach it to them. And there were certain prejudices at the time. One of the great prejudices was a kind of new orthodoxy that came out of a great, great composer who had himself been banned, and that is Arnold Schoenberg. And somehow the orthodoxy of writing serial music, 12-tone music, became so strong that it was considered an act almost of regression to go back to music that was not fully 12-tone. Now, a lot of these composers were certainly conversant with Schoenberg, but many of them didn't agree with Schoenberg. And so there was a tension. And so that tension is what's so interesting about this time. And we need to see those contrasts. We need to hear that polemic. We have to see how that happened. There was nobody there right afterwards with the new orthodoxy of 12-tone music and with the also heavy influence and prejudices of electronic music, even though one or two of those composers had already started experimenting with new media back in the late 20s. So we are confronted with the fact that the period after the World War was not one where musicians were going back and saying, well, what happened to the music of my old friend Walter Braunfels? What happened to my friend Franz Schrager? What happened to my friends Alexander Zemlinsky? It just wasn't there. The question also related is, why did some of the conductors who were a part of all of this did not defend this music afterwards? And I think of great examples like Bruno Walter and Otto Klemperer, who knew a lot of these composers who had premiered some of their works. Why didn't they defend them? And this is a complex and a troubling question. I don't have the answer, but one can imagine that they, having experienced the terror of suppression and the fears that they had experienced as Jewish artists in Germany, I think they didn't want to go down a path where they could evoke that same kind of reaction in America or in England. Now, we know with perfect hindsight that that didn't happen, that wouldn't have happened, but they could not have known that at the time. And I think that that is some of the reason that there were no big champions coming from conductors, just as there were very few little champions in the area of chamber music, solo piano music, orchestral players. One, two, three. So what are some of the obstacles that I have run into in trying to bring this music back into the repertory? I think there's a resistance to unknown music in general. And there is a resistance coming out of certain attitudes, as in, if I don't know it, it can't be good. If this music were any good at all, everybody would be playing it. These are products to some degree of our very commercial society, where it is believed that the best product will always rise to the top and the inferior ones will gradually disappear. Well, we know that isn't really true. We know that there's such a thing as marketing that makes a big influence on what products might be more successful than others, which ones become well known rather than others. If a piece doesn't have a good send-off, a nurturing environment around it when it is created and for some time after it's created, it's likely to fall into neglect. Now, many of these composers were right in the middle of the composers whom we know, like Mahler and Strauss, Schoenberg. These were contemporaries and in often cases colleagues and friends, some rare cases relatives, but they fell out. Others were struggling artists and were never well known. And we know from history that the struggling artist, be it a writer, a painter, an author, a composer, is rather the rule, not the exception. So add the massive suppression of an enormous governmental and military machine to that, and you realize what these composers were up against and what we retrospectively are up against in trying to change that situation. Another factor is a rather surprising one. In the course of the last centuries, censorship of artists and musicians was common. The churches did it, the royalty did it, governments did it. Now today, I think we tell ourselves that we don't really have it, at least not in that form any longer. But there's a more subtle form of censorship. I refer to it as the oblique censor. And that is most classical music institutions are under pressure to sell tickets, to somehow or other make an economic model that works. And that there is a tendency to avoid taking chances on music that is not known. And so this becomes a way that music is weeded out from awareness, not because anybody's saying it isn't good, not because anybody's saying it shouldn't be, it's because they're saying it may not sell. And if it won't sell, I, as a producer of music, am not going to take a chance on it. This oblique censorship includes many things, but amongst all the others, it includes reviving and bringing music of these recovered voices, composers, to the awareness of the public because they're afraid. But I remain optimistic because I know that our public, our music lovers, actually want to employ open ears, to hear things that they haven't heard before, and to persevere in their curiosity. So what is my job? What is my mission? My mission is to put it out there in a form that they can hear the music and that they can learn about the music, and they will themselves do the rest. And every individual can help. All you have to do is listen and then encourage your families, your friends, your colleagues to listen to the music that you discover that you like.
I can't really begin to explain how much development, how much growth, how much networking and personal connections I've made that I'm sure will last a lifetime at Colburn. And this place is so unique because we have projects like the Recovered Voices that can really hone in on really special and unique ideas cultivated by students, faculty, partners of the school. And because we're such a small community, things are really able to kind of get off the ground and really develop quickly in that sense. And the Recovered Voices program I've been a part of since I think my freshman year, and possibly every year throughout. James Conlon and Bob Elias have been obviously formative in that, and I've really grown to discover some interesting and vital pieces in the classical music literature.
Our young musicians are understanding that this is not about tokenism. This is not you do a project which has a name on it as a gesture toward composition that has been lost and composers who lost their lives. It is not about that. It is about integrating that music into themselves, passing it on, and integrating it into the repertoire. For instance, I'm much happier to see a performance of Schulhoff chamber music or piano music integrated into a program with Beethoven, Brahms, Debussy, and something contemporary. In other words, that's its true place. That's where it belongs, not in a ghetto somewhere else outside of that. So that's the ultimate goal. And I think we are working toward realizing that goal with this project at the Colburn School.
first time I actually played it, I was determined to make it the best I could possibly make it, because I wanted to create a completely different sound for each movement. And I think that's one of the hardest things about this piece, is creating a different kind of sound for each movement. But I really think that we accomplished that. And I think that out of all the pieces I've played, and at least in the string quartet repertoire, this is definitely one of the highlights for me.
I'm looking forward in the coming episodes of this series to exploring in depth the music of Erwin Schulhoff. And in 3 separate episodes, we'll look at his early life, the so-called Dadaist period, what he was doing in the swirling times of the 1920s, and where he moved away from this in his later years in the 30s and up until the time of his untimely death in 1942. And I think the listener can look forward to hearing some very varied music, and some of it played by the students of the Colburn School. So as we close out today, I want to encourage you to revisit us. I will be giving 3 talks on Erwin Schulhoff. See you then.